So I want to remind a couple of things. So we're going to be talking mostly about the peripheral nervous system. We will have to invoke some stuff from the central. So motor controls. First, we need to define what are the effectors. We mentioned it before. The effectors are skeletal muscles, smooth muscles, cardiac muscle, and glands. Now, these effectors are under control of autonomic nervous system, and that's what we're going to be talking about next week. Autonomic control. Skeletal muscles as effectors are under control of somatic nervous system, as you may remember, and that's what we do to an extent. We're going to be talking about that. So, how does a nerve communicate with a muscle? So this is an axonal branch right here, and this will be a surface that's going to be a muscle fiber. This is going to be pre-synaptic terminal. This whole structure right here is called neuromuscular junction, NMJ. Neuromuscular junction. So that's the place where, that's basically a synapse between the presynaptic terminal of the motor neuron and the muscle fiber. The neurotransmitter that will be released into the synaptic cleft of such neuromuscular junction will always be so-called no exceptions. Like at all neuromuscular junctions, at all synapses between the motor neuron and skeletal muscle fiber. Skeletal. The neurotransmitter will always be so-called. Now, other muscle types, for instance, smooth or cardiac, they are innervated slightly different. So for example, imagine that this is the smooth muscle. Then the autonomic neuron will pass next to it, and it will have this small bulbs called varicosities. And these varicosities will produce neurotransmitter. And you can see that this neurotransmitter will not reach one particular cell, but instead will be distributed over a whole sort of a sheet of cells. Does that make sense? So this is why these are called diffuse junctions. Sometimes. And neurotransmitter, the diffuse junction, can be practically anything. It can be a large neuropeptide, such as substance P, or it can be a small molecule neurotransmitter, such as nitric oxide or norepinephrine. So far, are you with me? Now, we will be focusing from now on, we will be focusing on the skeletal muscle control. We will be focusing on the somatic controls, we will be focusing on somatic reflexes in terms of the motor control. Does that make sense? We're not talking about any of that stuff until next week. Good? Okay. So Let's see how controls are organized. There are three levels of motor controls. We're going to go from the lowest to the highest. So here you have your skeletal muscle, okay? Here is the spinal cord, okay? Spinal cord, right? This is your cerebrum, and this is cerebellum. Somewhere here, side of the cerebrum is basal nuclei. Okay? So the lowest level of motor controls is segmental level. The segmental level includes lower motor neurons and spinal cord. Okay? So what does it control? First of all, it controls reflexes. And it contains so-called central pattern generators. So what is a reflex? What is a typical reflex? When you accidentally touch something hot, you move your hand away. Does that make sense? That's a reflex, somatic reflex. These reflexes are controlled by the spinal cord. Your brain has nothing to do with these movements. Does that make sense? Do you understand? Reflexes, somatic, motor reflexes are controlled by the spinal cord. What is the central pattern generator? When you walk, when you run, when you swim, you don't really think about the movements that you produce. Does that make sense? I mean, you can. For instance, if you want to improve your running technique or swimming technique, you can. But you're not thinking about every aspect of the motion. Does that make sense? You're not thinking how you're going to lift your leg up and then bending your knee and then move it forward and then extend your knee and put it back on the ground and then move the weight of your body onto that leg and then do the same with the second one. You're not doing this. Otherwise, it would take too much time. That makes sense? So those activities are basically not involving the brain. Good? Okay. Next level is projection level. So projection level includes pyramidal fibers that go down from motor cortex into the spinal cord, so basically upper motor neurons and motor cortex. Okay, so motor cortex pyramidal fibers. That's, we can put it as a role execution of voluntary movements. Okay, does that make sense? What would be an execution of voluntary movement? Moving that log to my mouth. Okay, good so far? Uh, playing piano, throwing a ball, stuff like that. Now, that is not the highest level of motor control. Actually, the highest level of motor control is called pre-command level. Basal nuclei and cerebellum. Okay? So pre-command level is responsible for planning and refining voluntary movement. Now, if you would look at the communication between these levels, this is how we can basically picture it. Look, a command level formulates the pattern of emotion, transmits this pattern to the projection level. And then projection level essentially communicates it to the segmental. What I want to be very clear about, really clear about, is that while projection and segmental levels they actually communicate with the skeletal muscles. Okay, so projection level essentially by the neurons, upper and lower motor neurons. Okay, it controls skeletal muscles. Pre-command level, basal nuclei, and cerebellum. These organs have no control over your skeletal muscles. They do not have access to your skeletal muscles. They do not have access to your motor pathways. Does that make sense? They communicate to the cortex, not to the neurons here. We talked about it before. I just want to reiterate it again. Does that make sense? Your highest level of your motor control does not have any access to your motor pathway. We good? Is that understood? So when we will be talking about reflexes today, and when we will be talking about reflexes, we'll be basically focusing on the segmental level, the peripheral neurons and spinal cord. Okay? Now, next topic of discussion is sensory controls. Okay, so first, now let's talk about different levels of control. And we're going to go from the lowest to the highest again. I'm not going to draw this picture again because I can basically show this stuff here. So the lowest level will be sensory level. Okay? Sorry, not sensory. I was thinking about sensory receptors. Receptor level. Receptor level. Which consists, not really surprisingly, of sensory receptors. Now, basically the sole function of the receptor level of sensory controls to sense. Okay? Now, whatever signal is generated at the receptor level, it is transmitted by a circuit level, and that's basically the ascending tracts, the ones that we were talking about in the previous year. Spinothalamic, spinocerebellar, and dorsal white column. So we can put great degree of confidence that's your spinal cord. And finally, you have a perceptual level. Yeah, which includes sensory cortex. Okay? We're good so far. So what is the function of your perceptual? It allows you to distinguish various modalities of your sensations. For instance, you can recognize something by being, smooth and cold, or rugged and warm, and, all these fine aspects of sensation, where it happens, the intensity of the sensation. All of these fine sort of conscious aspects are processed at the perceptual level. Good so far? Since we're going to be talking today most about reflexes, I'm going to save some stuff. We're going to be talking a little bit about pain next week, but we're going to be talking about reflexes today. Again, these communications between the periphery of the body and the spinal cord will include essentially the segmental level of motor controls and the receptor level of the sensory controls. Does that make sense? Okay. So we figured out the sensory controls. The last thing that I wanted to do is to briefly chat about the different types of receptors. Okay. We're going to talk about several classifications of receptors and how we call them. Your receptors. First of all, you can classify receptors based on the location. The exteroceptor and interoceptor. Okay. Extero obviously is the receptor that's outside your skin or superficial subcutaneous layer. And interoceptor is a receptor that is deep inside your body. Receptors in your joints and your organs, those will become interoceptors. Does that make sense? Is that understood? So let's actually do location. Okay. Next classification. Let's do type of students. So we're going to start with three sort of main categories. Mechanoreceptors, okay, that should be more or less understandable. Receptors that sense some kind of a mechanical stimulus, pressure, vibration, touch, stuff like that. Are you with me? Chemoreceptors. These ones will detect things like various chemicals, okay? Some chemoreceptors can actually sense chemicals in your skin. Some of your interoceptors, let's say receptors in your stomach, that will detect chemical changes in the stomach. Then you have not osmotic receptors, thermoreceptors. These will detect changes in temperature. So far, are you following? Now, I want to specifically put a couple of different categories. It's not so much about the stimulus. It's a different kind of stimulus. Let me explain. So I'm going to put it in different color. This is nociceptors. So nociceptors sense pain. Okay, let me ask you this. can your pain be caused by mechanical stimulation? Yes. So your nociceptor can be mechanoreceptor by nature. Does that make sense? Can pain come from temperature? Can pain come from chemicals? So you see, nociceptors can be any of these three, but we put them in a separate category because they are responsible for detecting pain. Now, let me ask you this. If somebody, okay, here's the thing, look at me. If I grab my forearm, I'm not really putting any pressure on it. I'm not hurting, okay? Do I feel that there's a touch, there's mechanical stimulus? I do feel it. Now, I start to squeeze it really, really hard, and it hurts. It's still mechanical stimulation, and just to extreme. Does that make sense to you? You see what I'm saying? One of the great examples of how we use that in medicine, you're all, I guess, familiar with things like Bengay, muscle rub, that kind of stuff that you apply when it hurts. Doesn't really treat the injury. It alleviates pain because some possibly mechanoreceptor or chemoreceptor in the inflamed joint sends the signals of pain to your brain. When you apply a cream like that, it generates through chemoreceptors another signal that basically mutes or overrides the signal of pain. Does that make sense? Like somebody is yelling on top of you speaking. You see? And then another type of receptors, which are essentially mechanoreceptors, but we use that word separately. Proprioceptors. So these ones sense position of the body. Okay, so I'm looking at you, I promise. Do I know that my elbow is bent right now? Yes, I do. Because I have proprioceptors, which are mechanoreceptors in my elbow joint. And I am aware of that sensation. Does that make sense? Question? Not yet? Okay. Now, there's so many things to uncover here. Another interesting feature of receptors, the kind of action potential that, well, let's talk about adaptability first, because it kind of falls here pretty nice. So adaptability. Receptors can be phasic, adaptable, and tonic, non-adaptable. Okay, now let me ask you this. From looking at the breakdowns that we have on the board, which of the receptors that you see on the board, based on the type of stimulus, which of these receptors will be adaptable? Or, no, let me rephrase the question. Which of the receptors will definitely be non-adaptable? Which of these receptors will be tonic? That sense what? Very specifically. What do you not want to get used to from the standpoint of being safe? So, any ideas? Come on, don't hesitate. Um, not really. You can get used to some chemoreceptors, but you're looking in the right direction. Just not try to be more narrow. What kind of sensation do you not want to adapt to? Anyway, yes, exactly. Pain. Huh?
I was just thinking we were looking at those.
No, that's why I put these two under the type of stimulus. And actually, proprioceptors too. You want to be aware of your position in space, right? So those are usually 20%. Now, some of your mechanoreceptors, like Merkel discs in your skin, they're phasing. You're sitting on the chairs and you don't really like even paying attention to this, right? Because those are you're not really feeling that pressure. Receptors that sense how your t-shirt touches the skin. Not really, no. Okay. You can get used to temperature, you don't really perceive temperature all that time. That makes sense? Chemicals too. Now, receptors can generate the action potential by two different uh, ways. So first is called generator potential. Okay. So this is a neuron. A sensory neuron. Okay. This is stimulus. Does that make sense? Now, this stimulus will, I don't know, open mechanically gated channels on that neuron, and this neuron will get depolarized. So you're going to form graded potential on the neuron directly. Does it make sense? Think of it this way. Stimulus, let's say it's a mechanical receptor. Stimulus opens mechanically gated channels, okay? Sodium flows in, depolarizes the neuron. If graded potential, that depolarization, reaches the threshold, you've got action potential, you've got the signal. Does that make sense? Now, another option here is what's called receptor potential. In this case, of course, you do have a neuron, but before the neuron, you have some kind of cell. Okay. And this cell, in response to whatever stimulus it is, will start releasing neurotransmitter. The stronger the stimulus, the more neurotransmitter you're going to get. The more neurotransmitter, the more depolarization on that neuron you're going to get. Does that make sense? So in case of receptor potential, you kind of have some intermediary cell. Do you see the difference? Here, stimulus acts directly on the neuron. Here, stimulus acts on the cell which releases neurotransmitter. You good? Any questions? Before we move on to reflexes, muscle spindle, which is pretty exciting. We're going to talk about encapsulated versus non-encapsulated receptors and what they do and what kinds of receptors you need to know. So receptors, generally speaking, based on their structure can be non-encapsulated and encapsulated. Now, what's the difference between these two? Encapsulated receptors are, well, encapsulated, packaged into a connective tissue capsule. That makes sense. So say you've got some neurons there, okay? These neurons, their bodies are surrounded by the connective tissue capsule. Okay, we're good? Let's talk about non-encapsulated first. We've got 3 receptors here. It's 3 nerve endings, hair follicle receptors, and Merkel discs. Let me briefly address all of them. So, 3 nerve endings. Remember this classification that we've got here: exteroceptors, interoceptors, chemo, thermal, mechano, nociceptors, proprioceptors. Remember those? 3 nerve endings can be anywhere and they can sense anything, depending on the nerve. They're basically universal receptors. Hair follicle receptors, specifically nerve endings that surround your hair follicle. They are quite obviously mechanoreceptors, right? And they will be considered exteroceptors because they are in the skin. Merkel discs are the parts of Merkel cells. If you remember, Merkel cell can be found in the basal layer stratum basale of your epidermis. So Merkel discs are essentially mechanoreceptors that are found in the exterior of the body. So mechanoreceptors, exteroceptors, and they sense the touch. So far, we good? Now let's talk about encapsulated receptors. So here I'm going to break them down into 2 categories because it kind of makes sense. Exteroceptors, and that will be with an asterisk, a bit of an asterisk here. And introceptors. So in introceptor category, we're going to have 3: muscle spindle, tendon organs, and kinesthetic receptor or joint receptor. So look at the names. Muscle spindle. Where are you going to find it? Where is it? That's muscle spindle. Any idea? Based on the name. It's in the muscle. Tendon organ. Tendon, obviously. And kinesthetic receptor, joint receptors in the joint. Okay? So all these 3 receptors can be categorized as proprioceptors. They allow you to detect your position. That makes sense? Now, exteroceptors, and you can see why I put it with an asterisk. So we've got Meissner corpuscles, lamellar corpuscles, also known as Pacinian corpuscles, and bulbous corpuscles, or Ruffini endings. Okay, now, what is the difference between them? If you would project it, now let's draw a little bit of a basic skin structure. Okay, so you've got epidermis, you've got dermis, and you've got subcutaneous tissue. First of all those receptors basically sense touch or vibration. Okay, does that make sense? You understand that? Now, masonry corpuscles will be in the superficial dermis. The Miller will be kind of deeper in the middle. And bulbous corpuscles will be concentrated mostly in the subcutaneous tissue. So which of these three, masonry, lamellar, or bulbous, will be sensing the light touch? What do you think? The one that's on top or the one that's on the bottom? Yeah, because it's closer to the surface, right? And light touch is more likely to stimulate. Does that make sense? And then lamellar corpuscle will sense deeper touch. So that's kind of borderline pain. Okay. And bulbous corpuscle will sense a really, really intense pressure and vibration. They actually can be found even in the joint capsules. So while masonry corpuscle is definitely phasic, adaptable, bulbous corpuscle that senses really that extreme touch is not adaptable. It's a tonic receptor. Does that make sense? Of course, we were talking about receptors, but we never mentioned a few really trivial and obvious things. Each receptor can only sense the signal that matches its sort of field of perception. Chemoreceptor cannot sense touch and vice versa, kind of, duh. And also, each receptor has a certain range of a signal. Does that make sense? So, light touch. Masonry corpuscle will be able to sense it. But for bulbous corpuscle, the touch will be too light. Does that make sense? Now, if touch is really, really powerful, it is so high that masonry corpuscle basically is turned off. Cannot do that, cannot process, it's just too loud. Okay? So that will be bulbous corpuscle. Kind of remember that it's not like they can sense whatever universally. Yep. Good? That understood. Questions here? Oh yeah, they are concentrated, these exteroceptors are concentrated in the most sensitive areas of human skin. Fingertips, soles of the feet, genitals, nipples. Okay, we're good? This is why they're so sensitive. You got it, right? Okay. So we talked about receptors, talked about motor controls. Now we're going to start talking about reflexes, but before we actually get to the reflexes, I want to discuss a structure of one particular receptor found in the skeletal muscle, specifically muscle spindle. There will be a lot of terms which I will try to make the sense of, okay? So we will start with what muscle spindle senses, and it senses muscle stretch. So how far it went, okay? And it's superbly sensitive. Muscle spindle can sense a minuscule amount of stretch that is applied to a skeletal muscle. Does that make sense? It's very sensitive. So imagine this is a muscle, okay, that does whatever, flexion of a joint, okay? You good? You following me? It's just a muscle. Inside of that muscle spindle. Okay, you see that? That's muscle spindle. Now, muscle spindle is really small. Are you following me? It's really, really small. But just as the muscle itself, it contains muscle fibers. So you have muscle fibers in the muscle spindle, and you have muscle fibers in your muscle. Now, remember that muscle spindle is exquisitely small, and tell me this. When your muscle contracts, which fibers will do most of the work? Fibers of the big fibers of the muscle, or small fibers of the spindle? Which fibers will do most of the work? Big ones or small ones? It's not this question. Okay, that's going to be big ones. So big fibers are called extrafusal muscle fibers. Okay, they do most of the work, while the small ones called intrafusal. Okay, now this one here is going to be our spinal cord. And just as any receptor, no surprise, muscle spindle will have sensory fibers extending from the spindle to the spinal cord, annular spiral, and flowers spraying and so forth. This is why I say, kind of, you just wondering what made people call it this name. But my main point here is that you have sensory fibers that communicate the signal generated at the muscle spindle to the spinal cord. Are we clear? We've got constant input to the spinal cord. And then, of course, spinal cord, there's a lower motor neuron that extends all the way from the spinal cord to a muscle. These are called alpha motor fibers. Okay? Now, first of all, let's take a look what happens to the muscle and the muscle spindle when you stretch it. Imagine that you are stretching the muscle. So the muscle becomes longer. Understood? And the spindle will become longer. So basically, the structure of the spindle will change. Does that make sense? Since the structure of the spindle will change, the signal that spindle delivers to the spinal cord will change as well. So it will look like this. More stretch, you have action potentials going like this, certain frequency. And then the stretch, action potentials will be much more frequent. Okay, we're good? You with me so far? Following me? Okay. Now let's create a not so hypothetical situation. When your muscle gets contracted, you may ask, hold on a second, what's the difference between no contraction and contraction? Well, let me explain. Let's assume that this thing is heavy. It's not. Let's assume that it is. So I'm carrying it, carrying it here in my hand. I'm not trying to lift it or anything. My muscles, imagine that it's like incredibly heavy, 100 pounds, okay? Are my muscles in my arm, are they stretched by this weight? Yeah, they're stretched to some extent, not a lot, but stretched. So do muscle spindles sense it? Yes, absolutely. Now I am lifting it. So my muscles, say my brachialis and biceps and brachioradialis, they become contracted. Does that make sense? Now I'm holding it like this. It's still heavy. I managed to lift it, still heavy. My biceps, for instance, and brachialis, are they stretched? They are. They contracted, but they also are stretched. Does that make sense? So your muscle, because it kind of contracts from within by itself, but stretch comes from the load. We're good. Now imagine, and I will need some, just to have a probe here. Okay, I will try to use my head. So imagine your muscle contracts. The muscle contracts. How does its length change? Look at the picture. A muscle contracts. How does it change its muscle? It becomes short, right? Now imagine that I have a muscle spindle between my fingers. Muscle contracts, and technically this should happen to a muscle spindle, right? It should shorten, and those fibers inside, they do not really contract. Those fibers inside, they should become this kind of, hanging and just waving around like being old, with a huge amount of slack. Does that make sense? And if they will be so relaxed, so there's going to be so much slack, then we're not going to have any action potentials at all. So in order, when muscle gets shorter, your muscle spindle should get shorter too. It should contract. Does that make sense? And this is why there is another fiber that extends from spinal cord to the intrafusal fibers inside of the muscle spine. And it's called gamma motor fibers. Okay, you see? So when there's a signal going from the spinal cord towards the muscle, signal that is transmitted to extrafusal fibers by alpha motor neurons goes together with the signal that's transmitted to intrafusal fibers by gamma motor neurons. Does that make sense? This is called alpha gamma coactivation. What it essentially results in, when there's a signal, for the muscle to contract and shorten, there's a simultaneous signal for your muscle spindle to contract and shorten. And when they shorten together, it means that without, you're going to maintain the frequency of action potentials like there is no stretch. Good example, look. I contract my muscle. I contract my muscle. If it's contracted, is there any stretch applied to it? I'm not holding anything. There's no stretch. Does that make sense? Now imagine I'm going to do the same when I'm hanging off the pull-up bar. There's going to be stretch because my body will, kind of pull it down. That makes sense? But since every time I contract my muscle spindles contract as well, they can maintain the frequency of action potentials in a state when they're not stretched. And that simultaneous signaling to extrafusal and intrafusal fibers, simultaneous activation of extrafusal and intrafusal fibers is called alpha-gamma coactivation. So far, making sense? Now we can move on to the discussion of reflex. So what is a reflex, generally speaking? Called a reflex arch starts with a stimulus, and we laid it down before, like when second stimulus, which enters sensory neuron. I mean, I'm missing the receptor. Stimulus acts on the receptor. Let's insert receptor. So receptor. Sensory neuron. Integration center. Motor neuron. Effector. Response. Remember, we used this example to explain what reflexes when you touch something hot and you put your hand. So you touch something hot, stimulus is the temperature. Receptor, thermal receptor, which is also nociceptor, senses this. Sensation of the pain goes through the sensory neuron to the integration center, which is a spinal cord. The spinal cord communicates with the motor neuron, which transmits the signal from spinal cord to the effector for skeletal muscle, and your response is to pull your arm along. Does that make sense? In general, this arch works both for somatic and autonomic responses. There are slight differences. For instance, in your somatic responses, the effector will be skeletal muscle. In autonomic, it will be cardiac or smooth or gland. Okay, but in general, the concept is this. Does that make sense? Good? If it does make sense, we're going to talk about the stretch reflex. And I don't really see a point in discussing stretch reflex and then knee-jerk reflex, which is a stretch reflex. Okay? So we're going to be talking about them both. Just hold on a second. I need to grab something. So it all starts with the quadriceps muscle. Okay, that's your quad. Okay. Now, I hope I will not fall. Okay. So when you go to a physician, when they check your knee-jerk reflex, your physician taps right here with a hammer. Does that make sense? Remember? You've done that, right? So what your physician taps on is called a patellar tendon. And this tendon is a continuation of your quadriceps muscle. So when the physician taps on the patellar tendon, it stretches just a tad your quadriceps muscle. Does that make sense? So we can say there is a stretch. That stretch is sensed by the muscle spindle, and you have sensory input into a spinal cord. into a dorsal form. Okay. Does that make sense? Now, within the spinal cord, that's not really very anatomically correct. There are some things that I would object to. In response to that stretch, if I want to be anal, then that sensory neuron goes somewhere in between the dorsal and the ventral horns, and it synapses with a motor neuron somewhere in between. We're not going to be too pedantic. And then they have this motor neuron that leads to the contraction of the muscle. Does that make sense? Look at me. When a physician taps on your patellar tendon, what your foot does in response to it, why we call it knee jerk reflex. It jerks up, right? And it jerks up because, well, not to that extent, but you get the gist. It jerks up because in response to that light stretch, your quadriceps muscle contracts and extends a little bit, extends your knee. Does that make sense to you? Good? Now, your knee, movements of your knee are controlled not only by your quadriceps muscle, but also by your hamstrings, okay? And when quadriceps contracts and jerks your foot, your opposite muscle relaxes. Okay, now you see that little brown neuron here? This is an interneuron. So if we want to describe it sort of in a smooth and smooth way, how it all happens, look, your muscle stretches, gets stretched. Stretch signal gets delivered to the spinal cord. The spinal cord generates two responses. The motor response that goes to the stretched muscle leads to its muscle contraction. And the response that goes to the antagonist muscle, muscle that does opposite, leads to that muscle relaxation. Very clear. Does that make sense? So when a physician taps, sorry, on the patellar tendon, your quadriceps contracts while your hamstring relaxes. Good? Now, another reflex that I wanted to describe is called a tendon reflex. And in this case, we're going to be talking about tension, but not so much stretch. I'm going to use the same CNS, same spinal cord. That's going to be stretch reflex, stretch reflex. That's going to be tendon reflex. Now, tendon reflex is more of a protective. So you've got your muscle, you have tension, and then tendon organ, which is located in the tendon, sends the signal, the sensory signal, to the spinal cord. Okay? That's from tendon organ. Spinal cord sends out two signals as well. One goes to a tense muscle, leading to its relaxation. And another goes to antagonist muscle, leading to its contraction. Also, does that make sense? So now look what happens here. If your muscle is moderately stretched, a little bit, then spinal cord will signal to contract the stretched muscle and to relax the antagonistic one. Am I clear? If your muscle is extremely tense, then this will lead to the relaxation of the tense muscle and contraction of the antagonistic one. So this process here is called, not the whole thing, so not the whole thing, but relaxation of antagonistic muscle and stretch reflex is called reciprocal inhibition. And contraction of antagonistic muscle and the tendon reflex is called reciprocal activation. Does that make sense? So you got it? Reciprocal because once your tensed muscle relaxes, the opposite immediately contracts. They only work together. Now, a few things about the practical use for it. So first of all, there is a lot of tension. Tension may, constitute a threat to the muscle. Does that make sense? You understand? It can be torn. Good. In order to kind of reduce the risk of tearing the muscle, it relaxes, kind of gives in to the tension. Does that make sense? Second thing, no stretching. After the exercise, they tell you to stretch. After the exercise, your muscles often continue to contract. Also, it helps with the cramps, right? How does it help with the cramps? When you make your muscles really, really tense, they will relax. You see that? So that's basically you engaging your tendon reflex to relax the muscle. Now, what is the importance of stretch reflex for our sort of day-to-day life? Can anyone do a split right now? I'm not asking to do it. You can't? Do you know of someone who can? Why they can and you cannot? Are you anatomically different? Are you? Anatomically? No. They have the same muscles, same ligaments, all the same. But some people can do and some people cannot. Anatomically, nothing prevents anyone in this room from doing a split. But when we try to do a split, we essentially put a lot of first stretching if we continue tension on the muscle. And while agonistic muscle will relax, antagonistic muscles will contract. And that muscle contraction prevents us from doing a split. Am I clear? So when people who do gymnastics, when they train, and they all the time they go a bit lower, a bit lower, a bit lower, you know what I'm talking about, right? Basically what they do, they increase the threshold of activation for muscle spindle and tendon organ. Does that make sense? Really good example of incredibly sensitive stretch reflexes you can find in gymnasts who, for instance, do different crazy stuff on the beat. Okay, because balance is all about stretch reflex. The example of the opposite, when stretch reflex is basically eliminated, is an arm movement, a shoulder movement of a pitcher or a quarterback, especially a baseball pitcher. If you ever saw it in the slow motion, the movement is absolutely unnatural. Human arm should not move this way. With practice, what comes with practice is that the stretch reflex of the rotator cuff muscles becomes so, the threshold of activation becomes so high that they can stretch their rotator cuffs for like an incredible length. Does that make sense? The downside, of course, is that, you can stretch the muscle only so far. So it's going to be rotator cuff there. Am I clear? In more general sense, one, what's the medical importance of reflexes? We're going to talk about one more. We're going to talk about a couple like general medical importance, and then I'll describe one more and we'll finish. So medical importance, look at this. You have sensory nerves, the fibers, yes, motor fibers. It's all your spinal nerves, and it's all your spinal cord. Does that make sense? So for instance, if you go to a physician and your knee-jerk reflex is absent, it means that either your spinal nerves or spinal cord are damaged. If you go to a physician and it's super active, same story. Does that make sense? So you can check the integrity of the spinal cord or spinal nerves using this reflex. Does that make sense? And by knowing, for instance, since we're talking about femoral region here, it's going to be femoral nerve. So essentially checking an integrity of the lumbar region of the spinal cord. Does that make sense? Cremasteric reflex in males, the ascension of a testicle, when you draw a blunt object on the medial side of the thigh upwards, it's a test for functionality of genitofemoral. There's an abdominal reflex when you draw a blunt object towards the umbilicus, towards the midline, and the umbilicus kind of jerks towards the object. Again, checking the functionality of different spinal. Does that make sense? Now, last reflex that I want to discuss. It's called flexor cross extensor reflex, which is a pretty interesting one because it involves crossing of a signal from one side of the spinal cord to another. Now, look at me. You see my watch? Imagine that my watch is someone who is grabbing my arm. So I'm like walking around, somebody grabs my arm here. Suddenly, I don't expect it. What I'm going to do, what do you think? What I'm going to do with my arm? Yep, that's the first move, right? That's my first move. And then what I'm going to do with that person? I'm going to punch them in the face. Does that make sense? So I'm going to pull my arm away and I'm going to push that person away. So that's going to be flexor, crossed extensor. Crossed, the other side of the body, extensor reflex. Does that make sense? Now let's take a look which muscles are activated and which muscles are inhibited. So I'm being grabbed by the left arm. So flexor on that arm is activated and extensor is inhibited. Does that make sense? Now, on the contralateral side, here, extensor is activated and flexor is inhibited. So we can say that ipsilateral flexor is activated, ipsilateral extensor is inhibited. Contralateral extensor is activated, contralateral flexor is inhibited. Less sort of pretentious way to describe this reflex is when you step on the sharp object. For instance, I step on the sharp object with my left foot. step on the nail, what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna lift my foot, right? So flexor, and my body weight is put on my right foot. So I have to extend my knee. Flexor, crossed extensor. Does that make sense? Now, you may ask, which reflexes should you know? Stretch, tendon, flexor, crossed extensor. I'm going to ask you, know the process. Know what alpha gamma activation in case of muscle splinter. Know what reciprocal inhibition. Know what reciprocal activation is. Know this, ipsilateral, contralateral, flexor, extensor type of thing. Good? So in a week from now, we're going to talk about a little bit about pain and about autonomic nervous system. And 2 weeks from now, you're going to have your exam. Questions? Okay.